Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fielka. Today is September 27, 2023. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast. I'm probably wrong about everything. It's an honor and a pleasure today to be here with Andrew R. Lenoir. Where in the heck you calling in from, Andrew?
Oh, I'm calling in from Red Hook, Brooklyn, where the sun finally felt like shining after a week.
First question is, what is the best thing for a human being?
Ooh, we do not start with the light questions. I like that. What is the best thing for a human being? I'm thinking about this a little differently today, I guess, because my sister just had a child, so I have recently met a 1 week old infant. And I don't know. I mean, I'm a book guy, as you might be able to tell from all the books behind me. So I'm going to say maybe exposure to reading and education, not so much necessarily refine in what there is to learn and what's true, but more to give one the basis for exploration, to like see the conversations that have happened and to understand the areas that haven't necessarily been plumbed to the same levels.
Really well put. And just to divert for a second, did you become a reader, one, because your parents told you to,
Hmm.
two, they did it as an example, or three, on your own?
I think it's not that I didn't have parental influence, because I did. My father used to read to us every night, but I definitely also arrived at it on my own because I know my grandmother used to have this story where I apparently, as a small child, before I could read, became fixated on some like old-looking books in her house. That when she eventually threw them away when she was doing some house cleaning, I came to her as a 3-year-old and asked, "Grandmother, what have you done with my books? What have you done with my books, Grandma?" And she said, "What are you talking about?" Because they're these old Time Life, nothing, leather books. And I said to her, when I was old enough to know how, I was going to read them. So I'm not sure where that comes from necessarily, but I definitely was encouraged.
Yeah. I knew that we get into this. I don't want to go into books yet, but I had to tell you this story. I'm a dumpster diver. I find books
Hmm.
that are 100 years old, no cat
Hmm.
poop on them. I mean, they're in mint condition. I also dumpster dive DVDs, thumb drives, any kind of medium. But you don't need a player for a book. If a book's
Hmm.
100 years old, my friend played a shellac of Finnegan's Wake song, a 7-inch,
Hmm.
one-sided from 1898. He needed a turntable to play it on. But a book, you don't need anything. And how can a book last 100, 150 years and still be mint when, like your grandmother, threw it out? It's a real true phenomenon. I think one of your quotes on your website says something about, everything will end up in a book or so. Just there's these great
Hmm.
quotes about books. So onward and upward. What's your favorite form of information, how it comes into you?
Ooh. Well, I confess I'm a bit of an auditory learner. I have always enjoyed other people telling me stories. I find I can actually remember the way in which someone told me and their intonation very well. On the flip side, I've always had a pretty good spatial memory for remembering where things are on a page if I'm going through a book in that way. Um, but yeah, I guess if you give it to me in a story, I'll be happiest. Is that an
Yeah,
acceptable answer? Story? Uh, you know,
definitely. That is very acceptable. All the answers are acceptable. That's the thing. I'm after your hunch, your guess, and I'm not
mm,
trying to put you on the spot. You could say, I don't know,
yeah,
or I
please.
can't answer that. So, why do you think humans collect or gather information?
Well, I think we're inherently pattern-seeking mechanisms. I mean, like I joke with myself that I'm like basically a filter feeder. Right? I'm almost a sponge that just I'm delineating these things separate from those things. These meet my taste. That kind of an idea. And I think on some level we're all doing that. We're collecting the information, the stories. I guess going back to that, before we're even collecting physical objects, more often than not, we're collecting those physical objects because we're collecting the stories they remind us of, whether it's a button, a painting, a book. all of these objects that contain more than just the sum of their parts, and what they become repositories for the individual.
Beautiful. You answered this, but I have to ask it anyways. Is this need or want to collect information more innate or more invented?
I think it's innate, because at a certain level, I'm not sure where else we would even go from there. I haven't spent much time with very small children before, so there's this like quality of, oh, this infant knows nothing, and yet like there's this baseline that we get to through the collection and the passing down of the things that we have collected that becomes the baseline for further exploration. And maybe one of the things we decide in that exploration is that the baseline was BS. I don't know what the stance on profanity here is, so I'm going to go with BS for now. But such that like even establishing what that baseline is allows you to go underneath it to reassess it.
Amazing, because you brought up the I think it's the New Yorker article on dreams recently said, or some article probed this idea that when you're in the womb, you're not so much having experience. So can you really dream in the womb? Because our dreams based on experience. But that's almost like saying the infant knows nothing. I would say you almost could flip that. The infant knows everything. And then as soon as it comes out of the womb, it's brainwashed. It's like Captain Beefheart. As soon as he popped his head out, he goes, I'm going back in. like Robin Williams calls it womb service. But what you were saying is knows nothing. Nothing is some sort of thing you're defining like information. But does the baby know nothing experience? Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, I guess this takes us into the concept of nothing, or like no thingness. The idea of there being the lack of differentiation between different objects and between self and other, this and that. We're arriving at, there is no delineation. We just are at the general realm of experience. And I ended up like asking about this in the last week, where it's just, so apparently you can dream in the womb. Are you just dreaming lights? Are you just dreaming colors? You're dreaming sounds? But then you have this other thing of Carl Jung looking at insane asylum patients in the late 1800s and wondering, why is he seeing a penis in the sun that is the same sign of the Mithraic bull? So I do wonder. I mean, we'll never know until we find some way of scanning the brains of the unborn. But what are those dreams in utero? Are they nothing, and are they just lights, or are they, as we've said, maybe everything? Maybe they are these things back into the collective unconscious, into the soup of all of our dream stuff.
Yeah. Amazing too, because my friend who attended our Finnegan's Wake Reading Club for years, he's blind since birth. And we tried to figure out, what does he see in his mind's eye? And another friend who's worked with the blind since birth human says he sees empty. He doesn't see black or white because he's never seen black or white. He doesn't have a reference what black or white is. But if you put his hand in a pot of water, he feels the water. Then you pour the water out, and then he puts his hand in the pot. He feels empty. There's nothing there. So is that what he's seeing? That was one way to describe what a blind since birth person sees in words. In words. You can't how could you put it into words? Because my friend who's blind since birth, he'd say, well, I saw this TV show last night, or I saw, he would talk like a normal person. I'd say, well, Kyle, you didn't see it. He goes, well, no, I didn't see it. I heard it, but I felt I was seeing it because people would describe to him what's going on, and he formed some sort of thing. So this is interesting because we're doing a project on archiving, and it's sort of redundant, but I want to go into it because Etymologically, archive means to preserve as evidence. And it comes from the word archon, Archon, first ruler, chief magistrate, the town hall or the public meeting or public building. So to keep free from harm. There's a lot of where this thing about archiving is. And you're into this being a historian, a preservationist. There's an attitude in Zen in the Eastern philosophy is be here now. That what is important is you live in the moment. And why would you ever want to save stuff if the important thing is to live in the moment? And just to suss it out, Wyndham Lewis said, the artists live in the present and write a detailed history of the future. So, how do we escape time? So the basic question is twofold. Is that you kind of answer it, but is this need or want to archive more innate or more invented, especially in light of this Eastern philosophy of be here now? And then you have plans to archive your own writings. Have you made any decisions? You just leave it to your family or friends, says, well, if I die tomorrow, put that box of stuff in an important spot. So basically it's a lot to tackle, but go dive in, Andrew.
I mean, yeah, there's a lot to tackle. I think you nailed it right there. I have a couple thoughts on the subject. One is that I journal every morning. It's just one of my mental health techniques. I recommend it highly to people. And in doing so, I jot down many of the. I'm attempting to distill off just all the dross of my daily thoughts and all my worries and stuff like that, such that I can kind of have a purer mental state by putting it all onto paper. But
Yeah.
I confess I do have qualms occasionally over what's going to happen to all of these books that I've created that are all of my intimate thoughts, and I'm not. I don't have a current plan for that, but I do occasionally, when writing them, have a jot to anyone who may be reading this. Please take this with a grain of salt, that kind of a thing. And also, just the way you framed it, with going back to the word archon. I've studied Zen. I have a lot of respect for Zen. I also have studied a lot of Gnosticism, and I have a lot of respect for Gnosticism. And so there's this quality of, when we arrive at archive coming from archon, and with this idea of, the false rulers, or I suppose Philip K. Dick is perhaps one of our more famous modern Gnostics, and the notion of, the empire never ended, and that our experiences are constrained within I'm going to knock myself about this. The black something prism. There's a third word in the middle there.
Yeah.
But I think that it goes both ways, because there's this quality of, I think, other people preserving for us what is worth continuing on into the present can be a crutch, and it can also be a kind of punishment, or even a way of, or a ball and chain. It's like that we preserve these old, outdated modes of thinking. We preserve the bigotry. We preserve, just these the detritus. We preserve these negative associations, versus we preserve the things that struck us in the moment. I think it's that interplay between the eternity and the now, and that the artist's role in some way is to tap into that nowness, that thing that is currently happening, and to translate it into a form in which it can be spoken, or I suppose sung. So there's that notion of enchantment, enchantment literally, the singing of something, the turning it into a chant, the turning it into that sort of a form that is making it alive, preserving it, and passing it on for others to be. And I suppose that becomes the question of every generation. What parts of the things that were preserved are still useful? What parts of the things that were preserved still nurtures and nourishes us? Which parts of it are constraining? And I guess that's maybe the question we arrive at every time.
Yeah. And really good. You evoke so many new questions. And one is back to, is it more innate or invented to archive? Is that the Egyptians tended to put something in the coffin with them. What was that about? It was this form of archiving, because my friend who's worked with a major archivist in LA, he kind of hated it because he said they hide this shit in brick buildings and they don't make it accessible. Well, no, there's people who go research and then bring them out into a book or a movie. But there is this sort of sacredness in, I just luckily got all my interviews in a really professional archive, and it was amazing to go in there, and the big like Citizen Kane climate control and everything. And that sure, it made me feel good, but it's like it was weird, and it's like, you come back from the dead and they open up the vault and they go, here's Andrew's journals. Like,
Yeah.
So is this need or want to archive more innate or more invented?
I guess it comes back to both, in the sense that like the desire has been there the whole time. I don't think the desire is invented. The desire is an innate thing. But the forms in which that's taken, and the forms that we've explored, are definitely invented. And I think, I mean, the case of the Egyptians is really fascinating to think about also, because, I mean, that enters into several weird ways of thinking about this, because, at that point, if I recall correctly, the Book of the Dead could be, it would be part of your wrappings. It would be written on your actual sarcophagus. It would be like the physical thing you're buried in. So I don't know. To me, there's this evocative quality of you're literally, well, I guess not so much if you're a mummy, but you're like kind of decaying into this text that is preserved and wrapping you in it. You are wrapped in this text, and that is the way you are being transferred out of the meat, I suppose. Or I guess a way of viewing this is that it is the nature of living things to decay and to die, versus there is this quality of making things immortal, which I guess in some ways is also like it removes them from the immediacy, because like the immortal works, the truly like, can we criticize Shakespeare? You know what I mean? There's that quality of like, once something is truly immortalized, is there still that room to engage with it more practically?
No, it is so well put. It's a great quote by Harold Bloom, and he says, "Do you believe in God?" And he says, I'll find it here, but just to paraphrase, is basically, no, I don't believe in him, but he won't go away. I can't escape. He's built in our language. It's like dodo birds aren't extinct. They're in encyclopedias. They still exist. Oh, but they don't exist. No, but the same thing with God. God exists because it's built into our language. So this is back to Philip K. Dick, because I love that, because he used to hang out right down the block in the Venice Public Library. My friend made a film with him, and Hollywood makes a gazillion dollars off this guy who said, who freaked out, the end of his life. But another friend has a theory that sci-fi writers worked for the secret police because they were prepping us for the future. And that's H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, and the list goes up to Philip K. Dick, because Philip K. Dick was saying, help, he knew there. So it's a wacky theory, something you would probably hear on Coast to Coast, but it is a funny thing, because all writers have some form of ESP. And so, there's this kind of thing that they could use the strategy of sci-fi to prep you for the future. It could be. It doesn't mean necessarily it is, but it is. It is. Any thoughts on that? I'm just curious.
Well, one of the places I immediately jumped to was William Gibson, the author of Neuromancer and Mona Lisa Overdrive, and I forget who his co-writer was, but the Difference Engine he wrote with someone else.
Yeah.
But the thing there that jumps out to me is that Gibson is kind of viewed in many ways as being the precursor of cyberpunk, but also that in some ways he gave us the modern internet just with his way of thinking about how would the human consciousness interact with cyberspace. And that, when you watch The Matrix, that they are at one point reading Baudrillard's Simulacrum to Simulacrum, but at another point, I think it was maybe during the production, they gave everybody a copy of Neuromancer to read. And one of the things that also jumps out to me is that Gibson also created steampunk with the Difference Engine, so that one person could be instrumental to the creation of looking forward in a particular way and looking backward in a particular way. And I've just found that really interesting as a a vein for thinking about like what the writer's work is, because I mean, it's one of those things. We're going back to Philip K. Dick. I think it's the adjustment. Oh, the Adjustment Bureau. It's the idea of there being this group behind the scenes that is editing things such that they all worked out, such that these paradoxes are no longer in place. And perhaps if there is some sort of group that's informing writers, it might be something more like that than there being a particular actual government entity, in my own assessment.
Like Paris Review, we know it was CIA, but how much are they flipping it? Or they're just like abstract. You ever read about abstract expressionism being a movement by the CIA? I mean, it's documented. It's not I'm trying to convince you, but there is research who people say here's some patterns, back to your pattern thing. But two things on the Matrix really quick is I went to a Black Lives Matter protest once, and my favorite T-shirt was "The Matrix was a documentary." But
I think in some ways.
Oh yeah, but who's the star of The Matrix? How do you say his name?
Keanu Reeves.
Yeah, Keanu came into the bookstore I was working with and bought all of McLuhan's books as soon as.
Oh, that's very funny.
Yeah, because those brothers who are now sisters, they're huge McLuhan people too.
I hadn't realized that. That's very interesting.
Oh yeah. So let's see, we did it. Do thoughts create emotions?
Yes and no. I would say that thoughts create emotions, but also emotions create thoughts. As I think that we can have emotions before we have thoughts. That is at least my own experience of these things. But I know there was that study at one point that suggested that I think it was they were scanning someone's brain to see the moment in which they decided to push a button or move a lever rather. And in the moment in which they were doing this, the impulse to move actually happened like far before the movement did, which seems to suggest that like there is perhaps not as much conscious choice involved in like what we perceive to be conscious choice. So, we might be talking about the same thing on some level. I suppose I would say experientially, how would I know the difference? But I'd like to believe it's both.
Yeah, no, that's good. Lakoff, neuroscientists say, 80% you're operating on a subconscious or unconscious level. Right now, I feel me and you are both 100% conscious. But how much is their unconscious or subconscious operating? There is some, but we don't, the neuroscientist says 80%. I said, that seems very high, But that was good. I like that. I asked, V. Vale, he put out the great magazine Research Publications.
Yes.
Oh, he's
love
brilliant.
Those.
I said, do thoughts create emotions? He goes, emotions create emotions. Which was okay. Is thinking more innate or more invented? Because I love in one of your bios, you say thinker, rare book collector, historian. I love thinker. Is thinking more innate or more invented?
I think we might be getting back into the question of like what is the label versus what is the phenomenon. Where I think therefore I am, as I suppose, like where we would come down to on one level of addressing this, but then there's also the quality of at what point are thoughts? And I think that anyone who's meditated for any length of time can probably relate to this particular experience of, all right, I'm thinking about, I'm not thinking, I'm not thinking, I'm not
Yeah.
thinking. And then all of a sudden you'll have some sort of weird visual, you'll be somewhere else entirely. You'll have an entire separate experience, and you come back and go, shit, I wasn't supposed to be thinking.
You nailed it, because I always repeat this quote when we get into that realm. Bridget Bardot says, I don't think when I make love. I'm like, good luck. How can you turn your brain off when you're doing the most sensuous thing your body can do? And it is like meditating. I'm thinking about not thinking. Well, you're thinking. Oh, no, I'm thinking about not thinking. So fill in the blank, Andrew. I don't know what I think until I.
Weirdly, my first thought was until I know it.
Yeah.
But then my follow-up is until I think it. But I like
that
both.
That is good. So know it means you're a Gnostic. That's, you said I'm a Gnostic.
I'm a little bit of a Gnostic. I think on a day-to-day basis, I do refer to myself as a Quaker, but I think that Quakerism and Gnosticism have more in common than I think is perhaps necessarily talked about in polite discourse.
That is good. So Quaker means what? It's in your sense, what are you saying a Quaker is?
Well, I mean, so very technically, Quakerism was started by started by, but put that in big quotes. But the most accepted person who is viewed as the start of Quakerism is this guy, George Fox. And it's during the Civil War in England. So it's a huge area of political, just upheaval and chaos. And it's not really clear who's in charge or what's going on. And also, as you might recall from your own knowledge of English history or whoever else is listening, the notion that the Catholic Church was in charge, and then there was the Church of England in charge. And then this is after that point where you have Cromwell's Puritans who are now saying they're in charge. So you have all these different competing visions of Christianity kicking in. And George Fox ends up having a vision of God on a mountain. And while he's on this mountain, he sees God, and he's like, or he has an experience of the divine, not so that he sees God. But and this leads him to believe that is the most direct and personal experience that anyone can have, and that should be the basis for everything else. And so, like, Quakers as a group, I my own thing here is I went to a Quaker school growing up. So this is in some ways saying that I identified as Catholic if I went to Catholic school. It's a similar kind of thing. But the Quakers, when you have a service, or at least under like Hicksite Quakerism still does this. Guernseyite does not. But Hicksite, you go to a Quaker meeting, there's no one preaching, there's no one telling you what to think. It's just you're supposed to sit in silence, and if you feel, quote, called by the Spirit to say something, you say it. And then that becomes the basis for a conversation or something like that. And,
so it's basically a practice. It's like a religious practice. So no, that helps me suss it out. But then you said, I don't know what I think until I know it, or I don't know what I think until I think it. But McLuhan said, I don't know what I think until I say it. And Joan Didion says, I don't know what I think until I write it. But really, the question is, you've anticipated this so well because you're so dang articulate. Can humans think without language?
I think we can think in visual imagery without language, but they're very closely connected. And I mean, going back to our earlier mention of comics and underground comics, I think this is part of why the comic form is so effective, is that, before we even have formal language in the sense of, you and I speaking English, we have the semiotic understanding of, this symbol plus that symbol equals third symbol, and that we understood what happened there, whereas happy face, broken object, sad face, we can tell a story out of that even though there was no language involved. And I think that predates language. It's the precursor to language. And I think that's cave painting, that's
Yeah.
That's dreams. That's a lot of logic, symbolic logic rather.
Yeah. Very good. Chomsky says a language is not just words. It's a culture, a tradition, a unification of community, a whole history that creates what a community is. What do you do when language doesn't work? When language breaks down, what do you do?
I mean, I think in some ways that's where we're at as a society right now. Am I right? There's this quality of the things that we're saying don't mean the things that we think that they mean. Which version of freedom are we talking about when like the political parties come together? What do we mean by democracy? These are, you have an entire section of the populace that's very proudly stating we're not a democracy. And I ask myself, well, what does that mean then? What are you saying? That we're not a democracy? Okay, so then what are we?
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess. I mean, I suppose if I was going to go somewhere practical with this, is the notion of we would need to find new common ground, new common terms. And I think that in some ways, to like, get a little bit outside of like what we normally consider with this, that this says a lot about like the nature of which, in our very interconnected, hyper-connected even world, that like I have interacted with book collectors and with fellow enthusiasts of things that interest me, who I don't necessarily speak the same language as, like very fluently. It's like we're both speaking English, but they're speaking it through a translator, and I'm speaking it. But we're actually talking through the intermediary of the things we both can appreciate, and that sort of transcends the language. Like the love is the thing that is allowing us to get around the language issues.
Yeah. That's like record collectors. It's a mint, or it's mint, or it's mint plus, or it's mint minus, And so you have to kind of find the language of what mint means on the condition of the scratches on the vinyl,
Or even like a name. A name is separate from language, such that, I'm buying this book from a French person saying, oh, yes, it has this guy's name on it. Like, oh, yes, that guy's name. And the rest of it is translated, but we both knew who we were talking about, and we both had our own internal interpretations of the person we were talking about and what all the things they're connected to and what that means.
Right. I blew up Blinky Brown with a Xerox machine so that I could really look at it, even though it wasn't in color, because I felt like someday that I'm not going to be able to find that comic again, and I want it on a notebook on my shelf. Then I lost the notebook. So I hope I keep. But your observations of humans in general, are we more thinking beings or more feeling beings?
I think we're more feeling beings, but we like to think that we're more thinking beings. Nice. And we think that we're thinking when we're actually feeling.
Yeah.
And I think that generally speaking is most of the time. And sometimes we have wrong thoughts, and sometimes we have, complicated thoughts that need to be felt further,
Two questions from Alan Turing, 1950s. One, is thinking a function of the soul?
Wow. Alan Turing asked that?
Yep.
I love that.
Isn't it? Oh, you should hear. Once you talk, I'll tell you a couple things what people said. Because I'm
really curious about that.
I've been interviewing for about 40 years. I think I started asking that about 5 years ago. I'm not even sure when it came in, but when I saw these two questions he asked, I was like blown away.
All right, so let's think about that. I mean, it's funny, where my head goes is that it is human to quest, it is human to search, it is part of the soul's nature to search out for things in that sense.
Yeah.
So I guess that's thinking. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if it's linguistic thinking, but it is searching. And I think to search, which is in some ways a form of thinking, or sometimes is a form of thinking, uh, that is connected innately to having a soul.
Yeah. And it goes back to you saying semiotics. A lot of people go, well, it depends on what you mean by thinking. And then you go, well, it depends a lot. Most of them say it depends on what you mean by the soul. And I usually
Mm,
go, come on. I mean, basically, when Lily Tomlin said reality is a collective hunch, we still collectively kind of think we know when someone says a soul, mind, body, soul. We sort of feel what we think they mean, but it's like when you say is thinking a function of the soul, they're like, well, what is the soul? It's like, come on, you know, and of course I don't know what the soul is, but I can try to put it into words and have a commonality with me and you. Well, we kind of think the soul is this.
mm.
The second Turing question is, can machines think?
I mean, these days that feels a little bit more like a loaded question, and I am torn on that at the moment. I think it's one of those things where I'm not saying that a machine can't think, because I'm sure at some point I'll be presented with irrefutable evidence that one is thinking. Um, but at the moment, are they thinking, or are they replicating the mechanisms of thought?
Yeah.
And I guess that creates a question of what the difference is. And I'm not convinced that I know one
Yeah.
way or the other, really. But it's a fascinating question to consider.
Yeah.
Certainly, possibly.
Is that what we've been raised in education, American education system is, okay, I'm going to tell you something, now repeat it back to me. That's
Mm.
replicating, you know, but how many teachers push you a little farther? Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
In my day to day life, I would say that my life is structured around the pursuit of meaning, but in my day to day actions, I do lean a little bit toward getting some happiness here and there. You know, like it's like, all right, hang on, let me get my little pick me up, and then I can continue my pursuit for meaning. You know, it's kind of one of those where it's like, no, I could use a coffee right about now for my
Yeah.
happiness, and then I can continue my pursuit for meaning.
But
Um,
well, I got
I'm
it
not
from
an ascetic.
yeah, I got it from Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. He
Mm.
says happiness doesn't is temporal more often. It doesn't tend to last. Meaning tends to last. But this is again, we touched on this. Does the brain more detect consciousness or create consciousness? Like, is consciousness bubbling away and we're more so detecting it or more so creating it?
I go back and forth on this one, depending upon the day and my mood. But sometimes I even go a little further, and I wonder: are we just receiving consciousness? You know, sort
Yes.
of like the way that like a radio does. You
Yeah.
know. And again, I'm not actually sure I have an answer on that,
That's fine.
except that it's a question that has fascinated me as well, because it's certainly something we experience, but whether or not I'm the originating point of what I perceive to be my own consciousness, I would be hard pressed to even find a way to begin to tell you.
Yeah. It's good. It's like John Cage said, I asked him this, if I did ask him this question, he might answer. It's a very good question. I wouldn't want to ruin it with an answer.
That's a good answer, actually. I like that.
What's faster, speed of light or speed of thought?
Mm. I would guess. I used to have a thing for this where there's the notion of, if I have like a card or two cards, and I know one has to be, like, let's say I have an ace of spades and a king, like those two, a king of spades and an ace of spades, and I put them into two different envelopes, and I leave one with you, and I fly to, I don't know, what's the opposite side of the world from Venice, California? Somewhere like that. I'm gonna fly to Timbuktu,
Yeah.
and then I open up my card and I reveal that it's the Ace of Spades, which means that you instantaneously must also have the Ace of the King of Spades.
Yeah.
And if that is simultaneously true, I think that's faster than the speed of light, right?
Yeah. Yep. No, there's no right or wrong answers, but that one you got right. Audre Lorde, the poet, said you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. Yvonne Rainer responded to her and said, you can if you expose the tools. What new tool do you suggest?
I mean, one of the quotes that I have heard, it's a little bit of, this is a moment of me not necessarily hoping that this is the case, but I suppose fearing that it might be, which is that I have a cousin who about a year ago was very strongly, or a little over a year ago, actually, it was early to it, talking up about the Chat GPT thing and just sort of where AI was going to go. And I remember being very pleased and some extent a little maybe even disgusted by like where this could potentially go. And he said to me, no, the future may be dominated by the people who know how to use this tool.
Yeah.
And I do think that that's unfortunately rather true. But I think that presents an interesting thing where we haven't decided what the world all of that will look like, such that if someone were to get a handle on this master's tool before it's used to build the house,
yeah,
you could influence what the house looks like.
Yeah.
Or you could, maybe build your own secret passageways in that house and know how to get around through it, that kind of a thing. So in that respect, I think, the stuff that our world is being built out of at the moment, I suppose this also relates to various technological knowledge bases in general, that have built our current world of various walled gardens owned by tech billionaires.
It's McLuhan was brilliant at rebooting or reinventing aphorisms in quotes. He took Churchill's "we shape our buildings and then they shape us," and he just made it up, "we shape our tools, then they shape us." I mean, Zoom has changed my interviewing world immensely in 3 years. Immensely. And so it's shaped the interviews to be better because me and you are present with our faces only and we're more attentive. If we were in a room together, our eyes would be wandering and we wouldn't be as attentive. Maybe, I don't know, but that's what I feel having done this for 40 years and studying the patterns of how, people are when they're being interviewed. So that just alone, whoever's going to understand what Chat GPT, I mean, in my opinion, when we invented language, we invented Chat GPT. It's the same difference. And then we invented the World Book Encyclopedia, which I grew up on. That's Chat GPT too. And then I realized
I did too, actually, funnily enough.
Yeah. And then guess what? I used to call up the librarian reference desk and ask her a question or ask them a question. They knew how to go, I'll go pattern. I got this book, summarize. So what new toy do you suggest?
New toy. This is a controversial answer from me because end of the day, I still think paper is the best. Paper will survive an EMP blast. It will survive a Cavendish event. It will survive all sorts of world-ending scenarios by which we'll be able to rebuild society.
Yes.
But in the short term, there is something very fun about the combination of your e-reader
Yeah.
and the wide world of all of the versions of books that we've read or
Yeah.
we've written, that can be read instantaneously. So I like to go between the two, where it's like
Yeah.
I never travel without a book, whether it's
Yeah.
a physical book or it's
Yeah.
it's an Amazon Kindle filled with many, many books. And I tend to do both, and so that it keeps me at that point. And, it is one of those things where, as much as I'm occasionally skeptical of like if the advancement of life is progress in some ways,
Yeah.
I do come back to every so often I'm walking around with hundreds of books in my pocket, and that's pretty cool. I will
Hello.
say that the rest of it is I don't love, but there is something to the experiential quality of, oh, you know what? Today I'm going to read some Mulligan Stew.
Yeah.
Oh, today I'm going to read another book, that kind
Yeah.
of thing.
No, it's amazing. You can't carry that many books on an airplane or when you're traveling, but you can now. It's an amazing phenomenon. And I always say, but if you drop your book in your bathtub when you're reading it, you can dry it out, but your Kindle may not. But they probably have them, they're so probably waterproof now, you can.
Well, they'll also run out of battery, which is something that a physical book will never do.
Right, right.
And also there's the whole quality of, do you actually own an ebook? You
Yeah,
probably don't
yeah,
really,
yeah,
especially if you're buying it through the Amazon store.
yeah.
Like all of these things can be taken away from you. They're already basically taken away from you. You're paying for your right to use them. Versus you can own a physical copy. You should own a physical copy of any media you really care about. It's sort of my
Yep,
personal philosophy.
yep. I agree.
And yeah, as you said, the joy of a book. You don't need a player.
Yeah, beautiful. Now, yeah, I never ask this anymore, but you brought it up. Is human progress more cyclical or more cumulative?
Hmm. It might depend on the thing, right?
Yeah,
Because I do have that question. You look at like Hero of Alexandria, like developing a steam engine, in the first century, and you ask yourself, well, how much else were they capable of doing at that time? Or like, I know the Baghdad batteries are controversial as well, where did they have portable electrical power in fifth century Baghdad? So I'm open to the question of whether or not a lot of these things could have possibly already have happened at some point.
yeah,
But I do think that the current form of our society in which more different types of people are able to express themselves as openly as they're capable of is an advancement that is unique to our current point in time.
yeah,
I mean, I'm struck by the fact that if you read like the journals of Lewis and Clark, or actually I haven't, I've just read like Stephen Ambrose's wonderful book on the subject and several other books on this. But like for instance, that there was this phenomenon they commented on where they're visiting these tribes on the plains that have previously not really been recorded, and they're talking to people who a spirit appeared to them in their dreams and told them they should live as a woman even though they were born as a man, and that these people take on roles of being kind of shaman adjacent spirit figures in the society of this tribe. And I think that's fascinating.
yes.
I don't have a particular like opinion on that other than that's fascinating.
It
And
is.
then,
It is.
to think that like that there's perhaps more leeway for that kind of thing today than there was even at a time where there was a time and a place for this in that culture. That like,
It's
it's
amazing.
not just some people are having that view, it's the people who feel called to this. And I think that's interesting. So it could perhaps go both ways. That maybe
Yeah,
there's technological progress and there's emotional progress, there's spiritual progress. I'm not sure.
yeah. It reminds me, Andrew, it's like a cone. We're going around in circles, but sometimes it swirls up and sometimes it swirls
Mm,
down.
it's a
Yeah.
good way of putting that. I like that.
What do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
What don't I worry about when I go to bed at night? Geez. Let's see. The usual stuff. My health, my life. Is this all going somewhere? And
Yeah.
I guess like also the the open questions of our society and if things are going in a better direction or a worse direction. But
Yeah.
it's funny. So I was in a terrible car accident a little over a year ago, and I broke my pelvis, and I had to relearn to walk again. And one of the other things was that for a while there, I couldn't sleep for a month. There was a solid. I've had lifelong insomnia, but there was a month in which I legitimately I didn't sleep because I just had the constant pain coming from my pelvis. Um, and since then I've started to just train myself to be able to sleep regardless of like all of these thoughts. And so
Yeah.
I mean, it's not to say that these things aren't useful, because I think that it always comes down to like that you can learn a lot about yourself from the things that concern you and from like that kind of stuff. But then there's also this quality of I suppose recently I've been learning to unplug from all of this simply because one does need to sleep at night. You know, as long as you have a meat body, it's probably in your best interest to learn how to sleep at night.
Really well put. So McLuhan learned from Ezra Pound that artists are the antenna of the race. You touched on this
Mm.
already. They're broadcasting and detecting the hidden psychic effects of our inventions. So we might learn how to cope with what we don't like about the inventions. So, Andrew, I asked you the question Marshall probed his whole career. Why do we ignore the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, even though the artists are broadcasting them to us?
Well, I think that comes back to the nature of the artist in our society. You know, that there's this quality that the artist is allowed to experience those things. Because there is this quality in which if I were to in other forms of work start talking to you about my unseen and imaginable processes, someone might pause and go, well, it's a little unusual. It's a unique take to bring to investment banking. That's a unique way of approaching running a grocery store, to be like driven by like your dreams and by
Yeah.
like your feelings about things, whereas art is allowed to do that. And I think that that's, partly fundamentally what we're talking about is that art is allowed to respect that as a real. Well, it's partly that it's the material that artists are allowed to work with. That I mean, I think advertisers may become closest to being allowed to work with dream stuff.
Oh,
There's that quality of this imaginal, invisible material that like is worth our engagement and worth dealing with. I think most people in society, or most roles rather than people, roles are not allowed to take it as seriously as the artist is. And then there also comes the quality of whether or not we take artists seriously and whether or not we reward artists to be doing that kind of work.
really good. Really touched on, do artists have moral obligation?
Well, they definitely have it to themselves, I would say. There's a quality of I mean, I would hesitate to tell anybody they need to make a particular type of art like for their society. I'm not a social realist. I don't think that pictures of somebody like with his hammer over his shoulder leading the proletariat like through a wheat field is like better art than somebody else's art that maybe isn't as like quote unquote socially beneficial. Um, so in that regard, I would say that people have the responsibility to be. I would say that if you're going to be an artist versus if you're going to be an advertiser, you should be responsible to conveying the truth of your experience. You should be interested more in truth and less in conveying a particular message for yourself or any particular other person. So maybe it's not. I guess this is what stops you. This is what makes you an artist and not a propagandist. Is that you don't have a particular thing you're trying to convince other people of outside of the truth of your own experience.
Wow. Really evoked a lot there. Yeah, Jacques Rouel taught McLuhan propaganda is just culture in action, in which called Marshall say advertising is cave art, And so that's very interesting. We study advertising, but this is when you said socially beneficial. Well, That's what Blinky Brown is to me. In a lot of ways, someone watch it, read this, they go, "This is horrible." And maybe he was what Mike Kelly was saying. Art is the last bastion of freedom. You can do anything. You know, the guy last week, he sold that museum some blank canvases.
Oh, I
And
loved that story.
yeah, and they want to sue him, and he's like, "Go ahead, sue me. That's more art. God, I love it. Like, bring it on. Like, dude, I'm a Duchamp clone. That's it. I'm free." So Mike Kelly said this thing, and just to get into two definitions or thoughts what art is. I'm curious your reaction to Mike Kelly saying art is making your problems other people's problems.
I mean, I don't think that that's necessarily wrong, but I don't know if it's necessarily that you by making art give other people your problems so much as you make room for the conveyance of one's problems and the understanding of it. And in some cases, that results in other people feeling your problems and perhaps also internalizing them. And in some cases, maybe even confusing them for their own problems. Like that's something that I've even had, as the consumer of media, where I'm like, oh, what that person said touched me so much that they're speaking directly to me and about me. And then eventually you realize that's just them being very persuasive. And it's not that they weren't kind of speaking to the things you were also experiencing, but they weren't speaking to exactly your experience. There was that commonality of truth that you were interacting with.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, that's brought up a lot because Mike's obit in the New York Times said, one critic said his art made me feel soiled. And I mean,
accomplishment, making people feel anything is an accomplishment.
It is an accomplishment, but to say the guy made it feel soiled. That to me was Mike was succeeding in his art. He really,
absolutely,
it's amazing. And so poet Fanny Howe said something, and I'm always struggling with these definitions of art, what it does, or like you said, allows us to respect. You really had some great thoughts in it. What art allows us to do. And so Fanny Howe said, the point of art is to show people that life is worth living by showing that it isn't. Now, I don't know what that means, but when I wrote that down, I want to ask people what they think she meant, or is there any resonance there?
I mean, I'm not sure if it's what she meant, but it is where my head goes hearing it. That there's this quality of the fact that life is meaningless, perhaps inherently, is actually a challenge. It's like when you really think about it, like what is life but this? That like if I were to give you a thing that I told you was a puzzle, potentially.
Yeah.
And I gave you a time limit in which to tell me something about it, in which to solve it, I gave you a problem in the sense that like it's a series of things you have to work through, and I gave you a time limit. I mean, like it much in the same way of like Nabokov's Invitation to a Beheading. Like, what are we living if not that reality of can we make sense of the stuff we are being presented with in the time that we have?
Yeah.
And I guess in that sense that art presents us with the possibility of finding a further meaning or with, attempting to, or being forced to make sense of things, whether or not they even necessarily make sense, but we make sense of them for ourselves, that is the productive impulse of our life. And that is perhaps like even, it's part of what makes life worth living, but it's also the essential stuff of what makes it our life versus life.
Yeah. It's so funny, Andrew, because you anticipated question number 34. Why? And we're only on number we're only in like number 9. Why is it so difficult for humans to consider the possibility that life might be pointless? So I'm not saying life is pointless. I'm saying, why is it so difficult for humans to consider the possibility that life may be pointless?
Well, I think a lot of us would feel kind of gypped. It's just like no one wants to be the guy who's told, "Oh, you've arrived to the party." Well, the party isn't real and nothing's happening. There are no party favors. There's no hats. There's no celebration. There's no cake. But enjoy yourself. Like no one really wants to be faced with that,
Yeah.
such that it would become difficult to find meaning in the face of the apparent lack of meaning. But I
Yeah.
do think that is on some level what we're all called to do.
Yeah. That's that. That joke where the dad gives his son a pony. I don't even know how to tell it right, but the kid's got to go into this room full of shit and find the pony. And he goes, I know there's a pony in here somewhere, and the whole room's filled with shit. I wish I'm sure we can Google it and figure out the joke, but it reminded me of that. Like, dude, you're getting a pony for your birthday, but you got to find it in this room full of shit. So you brought up two words that really, one word that I really wanted to pursue for a second, and that is truth. And that is Louis Buñuel saying, I'm for anyone who seeks the truth, but I part ways when they claim they found it. Now, most people go, that's great. I agree with that. But one person finally challenged me and said, that's bullshit. Because if I'm going to seek something, it's because I want to find it. And the cliche goes, the journey is more important than the destination. Why do we have to name or seek a destination if the journey's more important?
Well, I think that what we come down to on some level there is the notion of we can only find the things we set out to find then. Like we set out saying this was the goal, this was the object, and then that's the thing that we're looking for. And on some level, that's the whole, notion of that everything looks like a nail when you have a hammer. But it's also the thing of if I'm looking for a shiny crystal, am I finding diamond or am I finding cubic zirconium? And if I'm finding cubic zirconium, what are the tests I need to do on that versus a diamond to tell which one it's which?
Yeah.
And, you could learn a lot from doing that entire searching process, from digging up rocks in general. I mean, hell, I think you may be able to learn more from digging up a rock and carving it than in the rock being of any particular type of material. But if you set out looking for a specific thing, you then have the tests and you have the mechanisms in place that tell you, oh, I found the thing I was looking for. And I think that becomes the way in which a lot of people would respond to that kind of a notion.
Yeah. It's also reminded me of Edgar Allan Poe influencing the symbolist poets, saying, it doesn't matter what you say, it's how you make someone feel. Like the Mallarmé quote is something like, don't paint the thing itself, paint the effect it produces. So that's what the advertisers, all the rock poets came out of the symbolists. Bob Dylan, Patti Smith, Kurt Cobain, Jim Morrison. Then the advertisers come out of the symbolists. It doesn't matter what I say to you. It's how I want to make you feel. Like you don't buy a Lexus because of the ad. You buy it because then you see the Lexus and you go, that's who I am, And so any thoughts on that? What the symbolists got from Poe, this sort of paint the effect, not the painting.
I mean, I find myself returning to that. The line from Poe is all that we seem but a dream, and just that kind of question of which version of this is more true. And I guess it comes down to which one had more of a profit motive. Where like it's not to say that you couldn't make money off of symbolism, except that Poe certainly didn't. Which not to say he didn't try, but he failed miserably. And I think that there is perhaps something to that, where like when you're being rewarded a little too heavily for tapping into these things, that perhaps we've strayed a little bit out of the well, that kind of enters into a weird quality of like if it's financially lucrative or if it's rewarded that it's not true, which I don't necessarily know if I want to engage with directly as a thought, but it's a an idea I do wonder sometimes.
But Andrew, you broke up when you said the Poe line. Say the Poe line one more time.
Is all that we dream? Oh no, I might be confusing this. If all that we see or dream, but a dream within a dream. Oh, is all that we see or seem, but a dream within a dream. That's it.
That is good, within a dream, because then you went into that thing, because I love this quote by Samuel Johnson. No man but a blockhead ever wrote except for money. It was there a time when people like were cave artists making art because there was some sort of return, kickback, some sort of, and then kids like your sister's kid is going to start drawing stuff and you're going to put it on that art gallery on the refrigerator door. And, when is the kid going to go, wow, I drew something, now put it up there, and they get a reward? Or they're just like scribbling away because they're driven. Like, where's that kickover point where they go, oh, it's conditional. I can,
Well, I mean, the weird thing there is to consider what actually cave art was, right? Because like there's a whole question of, we get to these caves and the caves have evidence of fires being burned in them. They have interesting acoustics, that perhaps, you were drumming in here and it would have taken on many different voices and that kind of a thing. And that, the materials you're using to make these paints were potentially rather hard to come by and that kind of thing. And one of the thoughts that I've heard other people express, this isn't an original thought, is that whether these cave paintings are in fact like some form of ritual object, in which that like I'm not painting an auroch because I think it's pretty to paint an auroch. I'm painting an auroch because I need to kill an auroch to feed my family. And tomorrow, now that I have painted the auroch in the way that the auroch must be painted, and I have put my handprint over it, I've blown the ochre over my hand to like make the handprint on top of it. Now I'm going to go out and tomorrow I'm going to get that auroch and my family is going to eat well and like we won't starve for the next however many weeks.
That's go ahead.
Oh no, I don't know if I necessarily have like a full thought like to continue off of that necessarily, but just that the notion of that is perhaps where art begins. That it is like the reception of the possible. I mean, it takes us back to that question of are writers engaging in a form of ESP, a form of precognition, where to what extent is I drew the auroch and tomorrow I see an auroch? Is that you saw it or is that you willed it? And I'm not sure that we'll ever know the distinction between those two things. But it does seem to me that there's been this interplay between those realities as far back as there has been recognizable people.
That's question number 25. What was the motive of the cave artists? And you elucidated well on that because, Herzog goes into his film about cave art, which he got from a New Yorker article, and there's been so much written about it. I like, what's the motive of the cave artists? One person said, to keep people in the cave.
I like that. That's good.
It's like, come over to my cave. I'll have some crackers and grapes and cheese, and you can stay in my cave. But this is funny because this ESP thing came up again because I learned from one of my best teachers that James Joyce invented the internet and disguised it as a book. Now, really what he did was he invented Zoom and disguised it as a book, because you go to Finnegan's Wake reading clubs on Zoom now, and it is an amazing thing because I've run one with people for 25 years in a room and now for 3 years on Zoom. And it's way better on Zoom, but it's different. And I've already talked about the services of Zoom, but there are disservices to it. The thing
Mm.
is that my opinion is Joyce invented whatever is after the internet, whatever chat box, whatever new technology comes up, he invented it and disguised it as a book. Maybe not consciously, but it's because you don't normally read a book out loud with a group of people. And that's sort of the requirement to get the wake. You have to read it out loud with a group of people, staring at the text as the other people are mispronunciating the words, you know. So
Mm.
it's a fun little flip on, you know, is this sort of, you know, Philip K. Dick, you know, whenever people say they were ahead of their time,
Mm.
Martha Graham said, artists aren't ahead of their time, they are their time, you know. So it is. Now, are you more afraid of old ideas or more afraid of new ideas?
I'm slightly afraid of new ideas that don't know their old ideas. I think
Yeah.
that's maybe a good way of putting that. And also, just to jump in for a second here, the thing that I've always found rather fascinating, or it's a thing that I think is really interesting about books in general, is that it used to be that, you know, let's say we're a family, you know, and the majority of us don't know how to read. The mom doesn't know how to read. The kids don't know how to read. Maybe the dad knows how to read, and like you as a family maybe have three books. If we're English speakers prior to 1850, it's likely we have a copy of the Bible in English and we have a copy of Pilgrim's Progress, and I'm going to read that as the head of my household to my wife and children at night. And
Right.
so that in some ways, before we have the notion of literacy, you know, like with that, I myself as a reader will get the benefit of reading this book. Like
Yeah.
that entire kind of humanistic notion that I am a being that can be improved by my personal reading habit.
Yeah.
Like before we arrived at that, we had the top down, I am the father of this household and this body politic of the family by my reading to them, uh, either the Bible or you know, something moralistic like that.
It's really amazing because the other thing I realized after 2 decades with Finnegan's Wake was this is what parents do with kids. Your sister will start reading to the child, and the child will look at the book and not really know, just look at the pictures and know there's these symbols, but there's printed word and there's spoken word being blended. So we're turning the eye experience of reading into an ear experience when we're a kid. So we're already, so you know, the Pilgrim's Progress, the 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 father reading to the kids is a similar event. You know, they're how much are they looking at the text while he's reading? That's the key to the wake is
Mm,
you have to look at the text. But that's what you do when you're a kid with your parents. Read me a book. And you don't read it and the kid stares up at the ceiling. The kid wants to look at what you're reading, you know.
mm.
So, can you conjure up your earliest memory ever or one of them?
Um, One of them is definitely eating strawberry ice cream on my aunt's counter in her kitchen. Um, and perhaps mixed with that would be watching oh, Denzel Washington narrated an Anansi story animation that UB40 did the soundtrack to. And I very clearly remember this from my first 3 years of life. It's a little bit conflated with the strawberry ice cream memory. So perhaps it's the same. I'm not 100% sure.
That was beautiful. I really felt I got that. Andrew, is memory more a curse or more a blessing?
Oh, it depends on the day you ask me. You know, it's a bit of both.
Yeah,
I think that's kind of the truth of it. You know, all
yeah,
blessings are curses, all curses are blessings.
it's good. Tell me someone within your immediate family, then outside your immediate family, just briefly, who had a impact on you, kind of like a role model, and what specifically was that impact?
Jeez, I'm gonna start to sound a little bit like I raised myself, but I would say that my maternal grandparents were a big influence on me. Yeah, my grandfather was one of those guys, loved a joke, and would also love a story. I specifically remember being taught the story of Julius Caesar while making pizza once.
Yeah.
And I was like maybe 5, and I'm rolling dough. He's like, "That's why Brutus did the thing." I'm like, Yep, Brutus was a guy as I'm rolling out pizza dough. And I also have a grandmother who is tough as nails, but also the sweetest lady. And I think that from the two of them, I got a sense of that life isn't necessarily always the easiest thing, but it's worth continuing through and fighting on, and carving out like your own space within, and
Yeah.
maybe like finding kind of like a solace in that.
Yeah.
In terms of people outside my immediate family, mm, I guess my undergraduate advisor was a nice guy who taught me to laugh about things and not take them overly seriously, which also helps.
Big time. To laugh. So did your parents raise you a particular religion?
I mean, Christian for sure. There was so I got raised kind of with a mix of things where, on the one hand, we went to an Episcopal church on Sundays a lot of the time. My dad grew up in the South, and I was sent down to North Carolina every summer, where I was at sleepaway camp, but it was definitely more of a Baptist informed evangelical Christian camp, where every day they reminded you were a sinner and such. And I also went to Quaker school, so there was sort of an introduction to 3 very different types of Christianity in my youth.
Wow. Andrew, do you pray?
Yes, actually, I do. And a lot of the time, it's actually more of I'm not sure if you're familiar with the practice of centering prayer, but that notion of, so like the most basic form of it is the Jesus prayer, which is an Eastern Orthodox tradition, but the notion of saying, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy upon me, a sinner, as a repeated mantra. And that has been one of my practices for a long time. But I also think that there's room within that to think about things. This is, as I recall, I think it's Saint Theophan the Recluse, is a Russian Orthodox writer on these topics. Discusses the notion of like allowing that kind of prayer to become just built into one's own beats and breaths of their heart and like of their lungs. So it's such that like it's no longer actually a conscious ask. It's just part of the rhythm of your own body.
That is good. Like it's breathing consciously.
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
in your heartbeat and your breath conscious. Yeah.
And just being grateful for what the existence of one heartbeat and breath, but also that like it is a way of striving towards something further.
If God exists, what would you like God to say to you after you die?
I mean, I suppose the most like selfish version is I'd like to hear "good job" or something.
Yeah.
Like it would be nice. I would appreciate like a little like, "Hey, you did good, kid." I'm like,
Yeah.
all right, thank you, God. I needed that. But I think there might also be an element of I would appreciate like knowing if I was on the right or wrong track about something. He goes, "Oh, you missed a 0," and I went, "Oh, of course I missed a 0." Just like I would also appreciate perhaps like a light correction if there's any points on which I need to be lightly corrected.
Dude, you're really fun because 90% of people say good job, but very few add a couple other things like you did. That was really fleshed it out, a bigger picture view. Beautiful. Do evil people exist, or does evil use people as a vehicle?
Good question. I think that I don't know that I believe in the existence of evil as a force. There is like a separate thing that is evil versus good in that sense. I do think that there is a quality of like hatred and a like disgust for goodness that can arise, and that is what we mean by evil.
Yeah.
And I'm not even sure so much that it's that uses people as much as it's that people become so hurt and so cut off from the possibility of goodness that actually like hurting others or the ability to hurt others or the ability to deny that good becomes the closest thing to feeling that for themselves that they can have.
Yeah. What's good is you really get it, Andrew. What I'm after is me and you versus the wording on the questions. So it's rare that people listen to the verbs and nouns I use. They just get the gist of that's a question. Now here's my answer. And I like when they shift, like I like you says, I don't know about the use of the verb use there. It could be other things. The hidden question really is, Andrew, is how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? And I set this one up with a few modern thinkers. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. Coppola stole from the Mob and the Samurais, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. JFK said, forgive your enemy, but don't forget their name. And Fellini says, I need an enemy. So it's a lot of thoughts. The basic question is, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? But first, how would you respond to Alan Watts? If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
I mean, I think Alan Watts has a point. I would say that's good because, anyone can oppose you. It's the people that you acknowledge that their opposition bothers you that like have actually become your enemy, or they've started to define you in a way, because like you now stand in opposition to whatever they are as a separate thing. Yeah, I would say it's probably a split between that and JFK for me personally, where, it's a little bit of remember that there are people out there who have had these sorts of positions, but don't put too much emphasis on it because, like, if you are living for your enemies, even if it's just to prove them wrong, that doesn't sound very happy. That doesn't sound very much like you're trying to succeed for the goodness of succeeding or for your own pleasure in doing so, or if you're just doing it to teach somebody else a lesson or get back at somebody else.
Yeah. That's I go along with that because it's like, I'm gonna get you back. It's like, don't turn into your enemy. I mean, that's JFK is pretty heavy. Forgive your enemy. That's pretty heavy to say that. A lot of people can't forgive, but don't forget their name is almost like, well, I'm still going to carry this burden. Oh, yeah, I forgot you're my enemy.
It's like, remember the lesson, but don't get caught up on the problem.
That's it. Forgive the sin. What is it? Forgive the sinner, but not the sin.
Hate the sin, love the sinner.
Yeah, something like that. But it's Ram Dass said it so well. He said, I'm having a real hard time loving George Bush. And then American Indians, indigenous, say your enemy's your best teacher.
And there's also some truth there.
Yeah. So James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin 100 years ago. He basically checked out. He said, why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree? Years later, Faulkner said sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism. Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
Well, I think there's a degree to which we become complacent over like what apparent reality is, and I think that like I don't know why, but one of the things that comes to my mind right now is that 20 years ago, I guess, they built a robot. Philip K. Dick. Are you familiar with this? There was
Yes.
a robot that was programmed to say Philip K. Dick lines, etc. And I believe it got lost at an airport.
Yeah.
I have not reread the news on this in a very
Right.
long time. I would hope that someone
Yeah.
knows what happened to this robot now. But that there's something that comes with you build a machine that kind of looks human and says all the things that a person says, and at that moment you can truly appreciate that it's not the person.
Yeah.
Perhaps more than at any point up until then, you could really appreciate the divide between these two things. And so I guess there's a quality in which, life in a vacuum, life in the absence of anything else seems to mean one thing. But then, life examined through the lens of attempting to recreate it seems to mean something very different, because you have then tried and I would say perhaps failed to recreate it, but I don't want to speak for everybody with that.
Yeah. Andrew, I usually ask for 90 minutes, and we're just down to the last few minutes. I would love to do a part 2. So I'll send you some dates if you're interested. And it can be
Sure.
2 or 3 months down the line, because we really only gotten to a third of the questions, and this has really been intriguing and enlightening for me. So, just in closing out this, what you just said, I have to tell you, one is 60 years ago, my parents took me to Disneyland, and we watched this robotic Lincoln give a speech.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this was like amazing. Then now that's all, people think about as robots now. It's like they've been around for a long time. And, I wish I could time travel, and if there's a home movie of me capturing my reaction to that, like what went through my head, and why was I staring at a robot giving me a speech of Lincoln? And I can imagine he looked like Lincoln. He moved like Lincoln. But let's close out this part 1. It's been so fun. Is perception reality?
I mean, I think the answer to that is yes and no, because of course it isn't. On the one hand, our perception is not objective reality, but for each individual one of us, it's the only version we're ever going to experience.
Yeah.
So yes, it is literally true in the sense that it is what I am experiencing, but it isn't objectively true in that it is not the only reality.
Yeah. It's so interesting how people answer that. One guy said once, that's all you got. So is perception all we got? And what is the word perception? But is that the way the 5 senses are engaging with the world? Or, there's a 6th sense. Some people say, well, there's more than 5 senses, but we've sort of narrowed it down. This is what McLuhan called sense ratio shifting. Like when
Mm.
you invent the book, you change your emphasis on the dominant visual sense, the eye. Then when you invent the record or the recording device, there's the emphasis on your ear. So, what human activity exist where all 5 senses are working equally?
Mm. I'm not sure such a thing exists. I mean, perhaps, in a world of VR. And when I was in college at Brown University, we had this space called the Cave that was a projected space you could walk into where, I mean, again,
Yeah.
VR has made this a little more accessible to everybody as a concept. You could walk into a space where you drew everything. Where yeah, that is a possibility presented by all of this.
Yeah.
Uh, and so I guess we arrive at kind of a funny thing there, where in which we can create our perceptions for other people to experience in a way that hasn't previously been possible. So,
Yeah.
perhaps all of these will begin to take on new forms and new significances in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah, it was interesting because I did VR once at the film festival, and I was just put these goggles on, and I was in this room, and it was like pretty 3D. It was pretty amazing, and then there was a fire at my foot, in this room, and I was like, whoa, but I knew it wasn't there, but the sensation of my body going, your feet are going to burn, probably came up, and then I had to revise. The neuroscientists say that visual is the most dominant sense, but I don't know about that, if it's really.
There is an experience you can do that I know that you can find. If you Google this right now, you'll find videos on YouTube of people responding to this. You can watch just all the people having this experience. And I did it with a friend once, where there's this experience you can do in VR called the plank or something like that, where you can walk out on a plank at the edge of a building, and you see that you're on the edge of a skyscraper. You have sound effects. You can see the street below and the cars moving. And there is nothing to do but walk off of this plank.
Wow.
That's it. The only thing you can do is walk off and fall. And you will fall. You will experience the wind whistling, and you will see everything falling around you until you hit the ground. But you know that you're still standing in your living room, and there is no plank, and that nothing is going to happen if you walk off of it. Wow. That said, I've had a hard time walking off of that plank when you're in the experience, as have most people, I think.
That's heavy. Well, this has been truly enlightening, Andrew. I'm going to hit the end broadcast button, but I hope our conversation can continue forever and ever, especially once we set the date for part 2. Thank you so much.
Hey, well, thank you. I've appreciated being here.
Yeah. All right. See you soon.